One of the most misunderstood relationship dynamics happens when an avoidant person walks away from someone who genuinely cared about them, only to develop intense feelings later. From the outside, it makes no sense. People look at the situation and ask a simple question. If they loved them, why did they leave? And if they didn't love them, why can't they stop thinking about them now? Most people try to answer that question using logic. But this isn't a logic problem. It's a human behavior problem. And human behavior rarely follows the neat narratives people want it to follow. What makes this dynamic so fascinating is that it often involves two people who experienced the same relationship completely differently. The empath experiences connection through closeness. The avoidant experiences connection through distance. That single difference creates an enormous misunderstanding. Because when the empath feels connected, they move closer. When the avoidant feels overwhelmed, they move away. Both individuals are responding to emotion, but they're moving in opposite directions. The empath interprets distance as a problem. The avoidant interprets distance as relief, at least initially. This is where things become interesting, because avoidant individuals are often misunderstood, even by themselves. People assume avoidants don't feel deeply. That's not usually true. Many avoidants feel extremely deeply. The issue isn't lack of emotion. The issue is what happens when emotion reaches a certain intensity. For many avoidant individuals, closeness activates conflict, not comfort. The closer someone gets, the more vulnerable they become. The more vulnerable they become, the more exposed they feel. The more exposed they feel, the more their nervous system starts looking for escape routes. This isn't always conscious. In fact, most of the time it isn't. The avoidant person simply starts feeling pressure. Something feels off. Something feels heavy. Something feels like too much. And because they don't fully understand what's happening internally, they begin searching externally for explanations. Maybe the chemistry isn't right. Maybe the timing is wrong. Maybe the relationship has problems. Maybe they're losing feelings. Maybe they're not ready. Maybe they're better off alone. The explanations vary. The pattern doesn't. Distance starts looking attractive. And that's often when the empath gets confused. Because from their perspective, the relationship may have been improving. Conversations were deeper. Trust was growing. Connection felt stronger. The empath interprets those developments as progress. The avoidant interprets those developments as increased exposure. Same events, different experiences. This difference matters, because it explains why an avoidant can walk away from someone they genuinely care about. To the empath, the departure feels personal. To the avoidant, it feels necessary. Not because the person wasn't valuable, because the emotional intensity became difficult to regulate. Most people don't frequently leave relationships while still feeling attached. That's why many of them struggle after the separation. The common assumption is simple. If someone leaves, they're over it. Human psychology doesn't work that way. Behavior and emotion are not always synchronized. People can leave while caring, stay while detached, smile while hurting, withdraw while longing. Human beings are complicated, avoidants especially, because what happens next is where the real story begins. When the relationship ends, something changes. The immediate pressure disappears. The emotional demands disappear. The expectations disappear. The vulnerability disappears. And initially, this often feels like relief. The avoidant finally has space, finally has freedom, finally has control, finally has distance. And for a while, that feels good. Very good. The nervous system relaxes. The pressure subsides. The discomfort fades. This period often creates the illusion that leaving was the correct decision. But then something interesting starts happening. Time passes. The emotional intensity that once felt overwhelming begins fading. The nervous system settles. The threat response decreases. And without realizing it, the avoidant gains access to feelings that were previously buried beneath self-protection. This is when memories start surfacing. Not the problems. The moments. The conversations. The laughter. The comfort. The understanding. The connection. The things they couldn't fully appreciate while they were trying to escape the pressure. Distance changes perception. It always has. When something is close, you experience it. When something is gone, you evaluate it. Those are two different processes. Many avoidants spend so much energy managing closeness that they never fully process what the relationship meant until it's over. And that's when the empath they rejected starts occupying more mental space. At first, it's subtle. A memory appears unexpectedly. A familiar place triggers a thought. A song reminds them of something. A random moment brings the person's face to mind. Nothing dramatic, just small psychological echoes. But over time, those echoes accumulate. Because now the avoidant is remembering the relationship without experiencing the pressure that came with it. And that's important. The emotional context has changed. The empath is no longer a source of vulnerability. They're now a memory, a possibility, a symbol. And human beings often evaluate possibilities differently than realities. The avoidant begins seeing things they missed. Not because the empath changed, because distance changed perspective. One of the biggest misconceptions about rejection is that it always reflects someone's value. It doesn't. Sometimes rejection reflects timing, sometimes fear, sometimes emotional capacity, sometimes unresolved issues, sometimes self-protection. The empath often assumes they weren't enough. The avoidant often knows that wasn't the problem. But by the time they understand it clearly, the relationship may already be gone. This creates a strange dynamic. The person who once felt overwhelmed by closeness starts missing it. The person who once needed distance starts craving connection. And because they are avoidant, they often don't know what to do with that realization. Remember, avoidants tend to regulate emotional intensity through distance. Now distance is creating emotional intensity. The strategy no longer works. They can't escape the feeling by creating more space. They're already separated. This is where many avoidants encounter something they've spent years avoiding. Grief. Not necessarily grief over losing a relationship. Grief over recognizing what the relationship actually meant. Grief over opportunities missed. Grief over emotional experiences they couldn't fully receive. Grief over connection they couldn't sustain. And perhaps most painfully, grief over realizing someone genuinely cared. That last one hits differently. Because authentic empathy is rare. Many people offer attention. Fewer offer understanding. Many people offer attraction. Fewer offer acceptance. The empath often provides something deeper. A feeling of being seen, not idealized. Seen, the avoidant may not appreciate the significance of that while it's happening, because they're focused on managing vulnerability. But after separation, the value becomes clearer, especially when new relationships enter the picture. This is another aspect people rarely discuss. The avoidant often doesn't fully understand what they lost until they experience relationships lacking those qualities. Human beings compare, it's what we do. Not intentionally. Naturally. Every new experience becomes a reference point. The avoidant meets new people, has new conversations, explores new possibilities, and gradually realizes something. The empath was different. Not perfect. Different. They listened differently, understood differently, connected differently, created safety differently, and suddenly qualities that once felt ordinary become rare. This realization can be unsettling, because it forces the avoidant to revisit assumptions. Maybe the relationship wasn't the problem. Maybe intimacy wasn't the problem. Maybe the empath wasn't asking for too much. Maybe the real issue was internal. That possibility creates discomfort, because external problems are easier to solve than internal ones. If the relationship was flawed, leaving makes sense. If the fear was internal, everything becomes more complicated. Now accountability enters the picture. Self-awareness enters the picture. Growth becomes necessary. And growth is uncomfortable, especially for individuals who learn to manage emotional discomfort through avoidance. Many avoidants spend years believing they simply haven't met the right person. Then they encounter someone who genuinely cared, someone patient, someone understanding, someone emotionally available, and they still struggle. That's confusing, because it challenges the narrative. The problem can't always be the other person. Eventually, some avoidants realize this. Not all, but many. And when they do, the empath they once rejected often becomes symbolic. Not merely a former partner, a reference point, a benchmark, a reminder of what authentic connection looked like. This doesn't automatically mean they want reconciliation. That's another misunderstanding. Missing someone and being ready for a relationship are different things. Regret and readiness are different things. Recognition and transformation are different things. But the emotional significance remains. Because once someone experiences genuine emotional safety, it becomes difficult to forget. The avoidant may leave. They may distance themselves. They may suppress feelings. They may convince themselves they're fine. But the nervous system remembers experiences that felt meaningful, particularly when those experiences involved acceptance. Most people underestimate how powerful acceptance is, especially for individuals who secretly fear being fully known. The avoidant often carries an internal contradiction. They want connection, but fear dependence. They want intimacy, but fear vulnerability. They want understanding, but fear exposure. This creates an exhausting cycle, moving toward people, moving away, longing for closeness, protecting against closeness, seeking connection, escaping connection. The empath often becomes caught in that cycle, not because they caused it, because they activated it. Their emotional availability creates opportunities for intimacy, and intimacy activates avoidance. It's paradoxical. The very qualities that make the empath attractive can also trigger the avoidance defenses, which explains why rejection doesn't necessarily indicate lack of feelings. Sometimes it indicates the opposite. Sometimes emotional significance is exactly what activates self-protection. People tend to assume strong feelings automatically create strong commitment. Sometimes strong feelings create fear, particularly when someone lacks experience managing vulnerability. The avoidant doesn't reject the empath because the empath lacks value. They often reject the situation because it creates internal conflict. The problem is that by the time they understand that distinction, the empath has frequently moved on, and that's when another psychological shift occurs. Scarcity. Human beings value things differently once access disappears. Not because they're manipulative, because perception changes. The avoidant, who once assumed the empath would always be there, suddenly faces a different reality. The empath has boundaries now. The empath has grown. The empath has stopped waiting. The empath has redirected energy elsewhere. And the avoidant notices. Sometimes immediately. Sometimes months later. Sometimes years later. But eventually, they notice. Because what was once familiar is no longer available. This creates contrast. Contrast creates clarity. Clarity creates emotion. The avoidant begins remembering not only what they lost, but who they were with that person. That's another important detail. People don't just miss others. They miss versions of themselves. Certain relationships bring out specific qualities: playfulness, curiosity, hope, comfort, vulnerability, authenticity. When those experiences disappear, people often feel the absence indirectly. They miss the person because they miss the emotional environment created together. The empath frequently creates an environment where emotional honesty feels possible. The avoidant may not fully enter that environment while the relationship exists, but they remember it afterward. And memory has a way of becoming emotionally significant when current experiences fail to replicate it. This is why avoidants sometimes return unexpectedly, not because they suddenly became different overnight, because awareness caught up with behavior. The emotions that were delayed finally arrived. The appreciation that was postponed finally surfaced. The understanding that was unavailable during the relationship finally became accessible. But timing matters. And delayed understanding often arrives after consequences. That's one of the most difficult realities in human behavior. Insight doesn't always arrive when it's useful. Sometimes it arrives afterward. After the opportunity. After the separation. After the lesson has already cost something. The empath often spends months believing they weren't enough. Meanwhile, the avoidant spends months discovering that wasn't the issue at all. Two people suffering from opposite misunderstandings. One believing they lacked value. The other realizing value wasn't the problem. This dynamic repeats more often than people realize, because attachment patterns influence perception. The empath interprets distance personally. The avoidant interprets closeness defensively. Neither perspective tells the complete story. The complete story usually involves fear, not obvious fear, sophisticated fear. Fear disguised as independence. Fear disguised as logic. Fear disguised as certainty. Fear disguised as preference. The avoidant often becomes extremely skilled at rationalizing emotional decisions, not intentionally, protectively. The mind creates explanations that allow the nervous system to maintain safety, but eventually reality catches up, especially when the person they rejected stops chasing. stops pursuing, stops proving, stops waiting. That's when the avoidant can no longer define the relationship through pressure. Now they must define it through memory, through reflection, through honesty. And honest reflection often reveals things avoidance concealed. The empath's patience, the empath's consistency, the empath's loyalty, the empath's understanding, the empath's effort. Qualities that seemed ordinary become extraordinary once they're absent. This doesn't happen because absence creates fantasy. It happens because distance removes defensive filters. The avoidant is finally evaluating the relationship without simultaneously defending against intimacy. For the first time, they can see clearly. And clarity changes everything. Not always behavior, but perception. And perception drives emotion, which is why some avoidants fall deeply in love with the empath they once rejected. Not because the empath became more lovable, because they finally became emotionally available enough to recognize what was there all along. The tragedy is that recognition often arrives late, after healing, after growth, after the empath has learned lessons of their own, because while the avoidant was processing distance, the empath was processing reality, learning boundaries, rebuilding confidence, reclaiming energy, developing self-respect, moving forward. And perhaps the most difficult realization for the avoidant isn't that they lost someone valuable. It's understanding that the person they walked away from wasn't asking for too much, wasn't too emotional, wasn't too caring, wasn't too invested, wasn't too available, wasn't too loving, wasn't too understanding, but was simply offering a level of connection that required a version of themselves they hadn't yet become. And by the time they finally understood the difference between being overwhelmed by love and being incapable of receiving it, the empath they once rejected had already learned how to stop waiting for someone else to catch up to what they were ready to give.